Thank you so much, Donna, for the wonderful introduction. So like Donna said, if you have questions throughout, if you can put them in the chat, I will do my best to answer them as we go. Some of them, if I see, I may, say I'm going to keep them for the end, depending on timing, but please put them into the chat. I know we're going to go through a lot today, so I want to make sure you can get those out before you lose them. So a little bit more about me. I'm Sarah Jo. I use she, her pronouns, and I always start, I'm a really proud product of inclusive education. My best friend growing up has Down syndrome. My school one day said, we're going to be fully inclusive, no more segregated classrooms, and that really forever changed the trajectory of my life. I'm a K-12 inclusive special education teacher. I hold certifications in New York State, K-6 general education, K-6 inclusive special education, and 7-12 inclusive special education. I'm a queer neurodivergent scholar who does qualitative research. My research has been presented at the American Education Research Association's annual meeting this past year. If there's any other academics or researchers on the call, we'll know our AERA apps are due any day now, so we've all been pretty stressed about that. My undergrads would kill me if I didn't show you their picture. One of my favorite things to do is work with future educators who are in pre-service teacher preparation programs at Syracuse University. There was one of my favorite classes. As Donna said, I've gotten to do a lot of really cool things, including helping to write Pete Buttigieg's 2020 disability plan, where we made inclusive education a national expectation, trying to ensure that 85% of students with intellectual and multiple disabilities are in general education classrooms 80% or more of the day. When this plan came out, there was actually articles written that, oh, it looks like this plan was written by a special education teacher, because guess what, it was. So let's get started. I want to start by acknowledging that we lost a really big name in scholarship and inclusive education, breaking down, barriers. Dr. Thomas Herr, who is also a graduate of Syracuse University and was the director of OSEP. I want to share with you one of his pivotal works that I shared with my undergrads that says, from an ableist perspective, the devaluing of disability results in social attitudes that uncritically assert that it is better for a child to walk than roll, speak than to sign, read print than to read braille, spell independently than use a spell check, and hang out with non-disabled kids as opposed to other disabled kids, etc. In fact, in the eyes of many educators and society, it is preferable for a disabled student to do things in the same manner as non-disabled kids. As we go out throughout this presentation, I'm going to help break down some of these ableist notions that are held in regards to quote unquote fixing disabled students, which is not our goal. All of this is framed within a disability studies and education framework. So what do we believe in disability studies and ed? DSE considers disability as a social phenomenon, meaning that disability is not a characteristic that exists in the person so defined, but as construction that finds its meaning in social and cultural context. In DSE, we aim to disrupt the deeply held ableist notions embedded in education and society and reject deficit perspective towards students with disabilities to overcome exclusionary educational practice and ensure inclusive education. In this work, our goal as DSE scholars is to center the voices of students with disabilities and parents of students with disabilities. So I always start with, what is inclusive education? I know many of you have a ton of knowledge on what this is. Some of you may not know what that is until today. So we're going to start with, what is inclusive education? So inclusive education is a philosophical framework that views all learners as capable thinkers, authentic members, and valued contributors who can be educated within general education classroom settings in their neighborhood school with differentiated teaching and learning strategies that match their strengths, learning styles, challenges, interests, and needs. So you may be thinking, well, okay, who does she mean? You certainly can't mean all students. Well, I'm going to bring you over to my little flow chart. Our first question is, can you be included? First question is, all important, do you have a disability? The answer is no, then yes, you can be included. The answer is yes, we get to the even more significantly important question, that is, are you breathing? And if the answer is yes, you are breathing, then you can be included. The only way you cannot be included is if you are not breathing, if you are not human, meaning there is no bar to jump over, no hoop to jump through for a student to be included. Clarify even further, students with the quote most significant cognitive disabilities to have access to the same instruction and non-instructional experiences alongside peers within general education settings with appropriate instructional adjustments to meet their needs. Meaning again, that everyone can be included. A little note on language. Some of you may use the term mainstreaming versus inclusion, and although in fact we're even getting further away from the term inclusion, but for now let's look at these two terms. Mainstreaming, as we know it, is where we put students into general education. At times we do quote unquote appropriate, whereas inclusion is we are providing supports and services needed to make that appropriate. So instead of fitting a student in the box, gifting them the opportunity to go to gen ed for music, art, morning meeting. Inclusion is a process by which we intentionally plan for all students' success in the general education setting. To do this, we have to presume competence. Presuming competence means you should assume a person with a disability has the capacity to think, to learn, and to understand, even if you can't see any tangible evidence. Now you may be thinking, well, of course we do this. And why I lay this as some of the foundation is, well, there's a lot of scholars who will say no, until we have proof, until we have an IQ, until we have some sort of standardized measure, that's the only way we know what a child is capable of learning. In fact, that's not true. There are many problems with things we hold as standardized testing that don't show the capacity for students to learn. Which then brings us to this idea of the least dangerous assumption. So what is less dangerous for a student? Is it to assume he can learn, so we give him every opportunity imaginable and it turns out that he couldn't? Or is it more dangerous to assume that he could not learn, and so we didn't give him any opportunity, it turns out he could? Unfortunately, what is happening across our country is the latter of, we didn't think he could learn, so we didn't even give him the opportunity to, and it turns out students are capable of learning. Also want to acknowledge that inclusive education must be intersectional. Intersectionality is the study of the intersections between different systems of oppression. We have to look at disability as it intersects with race, class, gender, and language, which was conceptualized by Black feminist scholars. And it is critical to understanding and must be intentionally centered in our work. As we know, there's no monolith of disability. We have folks who experience disability through many different lenses. And so as we're creating and dismantling systems, we have to look at it through an intersectional lens, not simply a disability lens. Okay, let's jump back to, this is perhaps one of my favorite memes, when people say inclusion doesn't work, even though there's over 40 years of research to prove that it does. Let's dive into some of what that research says. Some of you may be needing this for IEP meetings. Let's talk about it. So why do we do inclusive education? Why do some of us spend our entire careers, our entire lives advocating for this? Well, because the research shows that it's what's best for all students. Students with disabilities in inclusive settings have shown improvement in standardized test scores, acquired social and communication skills previously underdeveloped in segregated settings, shown increased interaction with peers, achieved more and higher quality IEP goals, and are better prepared for post-school experiences. Now, these positive effects of inclusive education on classmates without disabilities is also well documented. Both research and anecdotal data have shown that typical learners have demonstrated a greater acceptance and valuing of individual differences, enhanced self-esteem, and genuine capacity for friendship, as well as the acquisition of new skills. Let's keep going. Students, including those with complex support needs, make more progress in inclusive contexts than in segregated contexts. The National Longitudinal Study, which examined the outcome of 11,000 students with a range of disabilities, found that more time spent in general education classrooms was positively correlated with fewer absences from school, fewer referrals for disruptive behavior, and better better outcomes after high school in the areas of employment and independent living. Now, this isn't just a few studies that have said this. This is nearly 40, going on 50 years of study after study after study that has said this. Now, if you want or need more of the research, please let me know, and I'm happy to send targeted articles and research studies to you. So we know what the research says. The research is conclusive. Students educated in general education disabled students educated in general education is best for all students, including non-disabled students. Now let's talk about the primary vehicle by which we can now get our students into those classes, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which is the only grant law that provides access and ensures the rights of disabled students to have access to public school in this country, IDEA. Talk about the purpose of special education. I'm wondering how many of you have ever seen this line at your IEP meeting. But the purpose of special education is to ensure access of the child to the general curriculum so that the child meet educational standards within the jurisdiction of the public agency that apply to all children. Meaning the goal of special education is to give disabled students access to the general ed curriculum, to make progress through the general ed curriculum, regardless of what that looks like. The piece that gives us access to the general education classroom, you'll see throughout the law, it says regular classrooms is the least restrictive environment. Now, arguably, the least restrictive environment is also problematic because it is also the piece that allows students to be segregated. But in terms of advocating for inclusive settings, let's look at what it says. A school district must educate any student with a disability in the regular classroom with appropriate aids and supports, referred to as supplementary aids and services, along with the student's peers without disabilities in the school he or she would attend if the student did not have a disability to the maximum extent possible. Now, the phrase I'm sure most folks have seen districts hone in on is this right here, to the maximum extent possible. Now, I want you to hone in on this phrase, with appropriate aids and services, along with the student's peers without disabilities. And why are those pieces important? Because it is saying that we have to give the supports and services first in gen ed before we remove. Secondly, this piece about with peers that without disabilities. How many of you have heard this notion of, oh, well, this is that student's least restrictive environment being over there in the segregated setting? Well, that's actually false, because if we read this, along with the student's peers without disabilities, meaning the least restrictive environment is general education, because that is the only place we can find non-disabled peers. So if a district is telling you, oh, that's the student's least restrictive environment over there, where our response is, nope, actually the least restrictive environment is general education, because that is where non-disabled peers are. And until we try everything, as the law says, we don't remove. It further goes on. So this isn't just in one place, this is in two, LRE. To the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled in special classes, separate schooling, or removal from the regular education environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Meaning the only way we remove is if, despite all the supplementary aids, services, supports, we still cannot make progress. And if we pivot back to, okay, well, what does the research say? It says that every student can make progress as long as we have those right supplementary aids and services. So until we try those supplementary aids and services, we do not remove. An IQ test that says an XIQ is not enough to rise to this level, even if they're saying the nature of severity is such, because we can still add in those supplementary aids and services. Now, I'm getting a question here. Is the cost of support/aids a driving factor towards a self-contained versus LRE? And really good question. I think there's a lot of reasons why we see students being kind of driving towards a segregated placement. I think cost may certainly be one factor. There's also a factor that, there's still this deeply held belief that disabled students, particularly those who are labeled as having complex support needs, are best sent in special settings over there where it's quiet. So that's something I hear a lot. And what I would say is we have to, any one of the reasons they're going to give you, we can refute. So if they say, oh, well, it's a distraction-free environment, actually the research would show, and I'm thinking about some of Dr. Julie Costin's research, that the segregated setting is actually more distracting. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about filling the gap. But the cost of support/aids is not supposed to be a determining factor in terms of LRE. It doesn't negate. I'm going to talk in a little bit about the portability principle, which I think will help help with that. And there is help with your question, Anne. And there is also a Department of Ed letter, a Dear Colleague letter that I can point you towards in terms of LRE and cost. That would help bolster your argument. But no, cost is never supposed to be a reason to segregate a student. So meaning a student is not supposed to be out of the LRE simply because of cost. Any advice on ways to advocate for LRA when the argument from the district is lack of staff, funding for TAs, etc.? Jessica, what I would say to you is, yes, definitely there are lots of ways to argue and advocate for that, including some of the Dear Colleague and Department of Ed letters that I can send to you. At the end of this will be my email address, and I can forward you all of those pieces. But if you're hearing some of those myths, I would call them, meaning like we don't have enough money, we don't have enough staff. Staffing is an issue nationwide. Still not a reason to segregate a student. So I can send you some of those things. Keep going. Another myth I also often hear is, oh, well, we're modifying the curriculum so much so that we're now watered it down. But let's look at what the regulations say. A child with a disability is not removed from education age-appropriate regular classrooms solely because of the needed modifications in the general ed curriculum, meaning it doesn't actually matter how much we have to modify, as long as it can be modified and the student is making progress, then it should be modified and the student should be in general education. So it doesn't matter if we have a vast difference in what the student is doing if we're modifying. As long as the student is making progress, that's all that matters. It's not up to us as educators to say, oh, it's too watered down to this point. That doesn't actually matter. So some legal pieces, some of my favorite legal court cases to help bolster your advocacy for inclusion. Oberti versus the Board of Ed from 1993. I always emphasize the years because this isn't new. The court precedents have been out, some of them longer than I've been alive. This research has certainly been going on longer than I've been alive. And so we've known this. Unfortunately, schools simply don't listen. So Oberti v. Board of Ed says a child should not have to earn his way into an integrated school setting by first functioning successfully in a segregated setting. Inclusion is a right, not a privilege for a select few. Success in special schools and special classes does not lead to successful functioning in an integrated society, which is clearly one of the goals of IDEA. Meaning, a student doesn't have to show success in an outside of gen ed place, in a segregated placement before we move in. If you ever hear an IEP team tell you, well, if the student does X, Y, and Z over here, then we can start including them. Now, short of really, dramatic safety concerns, there's no reason for a student to have to demonstrate over here in a segregated space before they do it in the natural environment. And I use the general education class as the natural environment. We know skill acquisition doesn't necessarily transfer when we do it in a segregated setting and then try to apply it naturally. The best way to teach it is through that natural setting, being the general education classroom. So this is the piece, if you ever hear districts say, oh, as soon as student demonstrates X, Y, and Z, they can go into gen ed. This is the piece I want you to pull from, is Oberti v. Board of Ed, 93. One of my next favorite court cases, also from 93. That was a good year for inclusion, Ronacher v. Walter, which gives us the portability principle. The portability principle, I'm going to first read from the court decision, which says, it is not enough for a district to simply claim that a segregated program is superior. In a case where a segregated facility is considered superior, the court should determine whether the service can make the placement superior, can feasibly be provided in a non-segregated setting, i.e. regular class. If they can, the placement in segregated schools would be inappropriate under the Act, meaning IDEA. So if you're hearing, well, we can do X, Y, and Z over here in the EC room, in the special day class, whatever you want to call it, in the segregated setting, our response is, well, what about it makes it so special? Because we can then bring that in to the general education classroom, meaning we don't have to be in one particular location for supports to be met. We simply need to identify what are those supports and bring them in. As long as it's something that's not chained to the ground, then it can be brought into the general education setting. Staffing can be brought in. Different aids, supports, curriculum can be brought in. All of this stuff can be brought into the general education setting. And those of you who have heard, oh, well, it's quieter over here, it's less distracting, I will say two things. One, I look back at Dr. Julie Costin's research, which says it's actually more distracting in those segregated spaces. The second, I will say, then we're robbing students an opportunity to learn how to navigate when life is distracting. I'll say personally, as a neurodivergent scholar, it's really difficult to do work in a lot of places, but had I been robbed of the time in my life as a child to gain the skills of how to do that, I may not have been here. So we're robbing students of the opportunity to gain actual life skills that they need. Coming back, Ronacher v. Walter, portability principle. So this is a really good one to point to when a district is telling you that over here in a segregated spot is superior. And I see a chat. Okay, so I'm seeing, okay, so this is a question about curriculum. And I'm going to hold it, Sean, I'm gonna hold it for the end. I'm gonna talk in a few slides about segregated and supplanting curriculum. So I'm gonna hold off, and if I don't answer your question at the end, ask it again. So what's the problem in US education? I locate the problem. I think about Dr. Cheryl Jorgensen's work, who has been doing this work, long before I have. In that, the problem with our system is that we have two systems of education. We have general education, one silo, and then we have special education, a second silo. And they don't talk to one another. I'm sure I know some of you on this call have experienced that at your own schools. So we see that systemically, and we also see that coming on the individual level at schools and, quite frankly, staff. So this two-system approach is what has brought us exactly to some of what Sean's question was about replacement curriculum. This is where we get things like unique, read 180, touch math, any sort of life skill curriculum you could think of. It's how we get these programs that don't actually help disabled students make progress. Now, getting to the point I've been sort of dancing around, that segregated / traditional special education actually builds the gap for our students. Let's talk about what the differences are. Traditional and special education. We see the goal as that is the goal being, and it may be implicit or not, is to assimilate disabled students through forced compliance to a non-disabled way of being, and is rooted in racist and ableist practices with direct links to institutionalization. Whereas inclusive education And again, some of us are sort of moving away from inclusive education. So we may say inclusive, anti-ableist, anti-racist education. Meet students where they're at. We bring the supports to them while working to make systems changes. And is grounded in culturally sustaining pedagogy, which is demanding explicit pluralistic outcomes that are not centered on white, middle class, monolingual, and monocultural norms of educational achievement, and is rooted in disability justice. Chris Cleaver, also graduate of Syracuse, wrote the book Educating Students with Down Syndrome, which is an oldie but a goodie, sums it up really nicely that inclusive education is to value another, is to recognize diversity as the norm. It establishes the equal right of all school children, a sense that we all benefit from one another, and the fundamental right of every student to belong. Inclusive education is simply making it so that every student belongs. We recognize diversity as the norm. Cozier and Ashby state traditional special education is grounded in the assumption of identifiable and meaningful differences. It is a field with deep roots in behaviorism, positivism, psychology, and medicine. The purpose of education becomes remediation of identified deficits with a goal of moving the person toward a more normative way of being. What does that mean? What am I saying? I'm saying that traditional and segregated special education, the goal is to fix the student, to fix what is broken. Whereas inclusive, anti-ableist, anti-racist education is to help the student grow in exactly who they are. It is not to make the student indistinguishable from their non-disabled peers, as I often read in IEPs. And you'll see perhaps the favorite meme that I ever made, which is life skills classes are the new institutions, change my mind. A lot of what we have is right out of what we were doing in institutions. We see direct links from what we're doing today in 2022 to what was happening in institutions. Segregated traditional special education utilizes the prerequisite model of learning that posits that students with complex support needs must progress through early developmental milestones before they're able to learn grade aligned academic content. Meaning you learn one thing, then the next, and they build on one another. And what we'll talk about in a second is that actually makes the gap significantly larger from their non-disabled peers and robs them of the opportunity to learn content that students are more than capable of learning. I share the story that I have a friend of mine who is actually the first graduate with Down syndrome to receive a standard bachelorette degree in New Jersey, and can't count backwards, but can get a bachelor's degree. So we're going to also talk about what are actual skills that are must-stays versus skills that we can move on from. And I'll share with you, if anyone on the call, except for mathematicians or any math teachers, that doesn't count, who can do the quadratic equation or the Pythagorean theorem without looking it up. And I share that because I certainly couldn't. I would have to look it up and start with something, start with some help. But no one has made me prove that I can master that before I can move on to something higher level. Yet we do that with disabled students, and then we stunt growth because of that. How many of you have heard, but it's a foundational skill? It's a base skill, it's a foundational skill, it is a skill that has to be taught. And I want you to take that and throw away what that notion is. Now, if it is a foundational skill, if it's so foundational, and I would argue that there's very, very few of these, they do not need to be taught in isolation. And instead, we're taking those foundational skills and teaching them through the general education curriculum. I don't know how many of you on the call have ever heard, but we take it slow. In this classroom over here, or with this curriculum over here, we can take it slow. Well, let's pretend that the curriculum is this entire line. And the general education class gets the entire breadth of the curriculum. So they cover the whole thing. If there's any teachers on the call, you may be thinking, we don't always get to all the curriculum in gen ed. And yes, I also never got to all the curriculum, but let's say this is the entire year what general education students get. Now, Our students with disabilities and those who are labeled as having complex needs may only get, let's say 50% of the curriculum. But over here, but in the same number of days, now in the segregated class, you're only covering 50% because when we take it slow with the same number of days, guess what? We're not covering everything. And you may only actually get 50% of what was taught in that segregated space through that supplemental curriculum. You're now actually getting only 25% of the core curriculum versus 50, because with that exposure and opportunity and to more skills versus over here, now we have a student starting, while yes, they're still, they got 50%, they're still significantly further ahead than if they were starting here versus here. And we do that year after year after year, and what happens? Our students continue to build the gap, and that has continued to be used as reason to segregate students. When the irony is what we're doing is building that gap. And again, I'm going to call back to what does IDA say. IDA says it doesn't actually matter if we have to modify and accommodate. What does the research say? The research says in the general education class, we're going to get the most out of it versus the segregated space. So when we're talking about, I'm going to think about Sean's question for a second about supplanted curriculum. So that's curriculum that we're taking and replacing the general education curriculum with. And I am always very, very weary of that. I think it's okay to pull different pieces from it as needed, but I would say we should be looking at the general education curriculum and modifying that versus taking a completely modified curriculum, because then it's a one-size-fits-all approach. I may have two students in the same class needing different modifications. If I give them a modified curriculum, I might be pulling the things that may be pulled out. One of the students may need those pulled out, whereas the other student may have gotten those and thrived with those and needed those as a jumping off point. It also, we know these curriculums aren't well aligned and don't actually give access to the general education curriculum in the way that they say that they do. So I am always one to say we don't use a different curriculum, we look at the gen ed curriculum and modify it from there. And if you ever hear the, oh, but we take it slow, I invite us all to think about that. Same number of school days, we take it slow, we're simply not going to get to everything. And that is robbing our students of the opportunity to learn new skills, thereby building the gap. So what instead? I've done a lot of time talking about what we're not supposed to do, and so let's get into what we are supposed to do. I want to start with the assumption that there's something in every lesson that every single student can do. I don't care if we're talking about 12th grade calculus or if we're talking about preschool. There's something in every single lesson every single student can do, regardless of the complexity of needs. In an ideal world, we'd be using universal design for learning, UDL. I'm sure many of you have heard of UDL before. There's three key pieces of UDL. Representation. We're offering information in more than one format. For example, as I'm going through this presentation, I have a lot of words on my slide, admittedly. I do that because for some folks, getting it in auditorily is the way that they get information. For others, it is reading it. So having both options available. Action and expression. Giving kids more than one way to interact with materials and to show what they've learned. I tell my undergrads, the job of a teacher, particularly a special education teacher, is to help students show what they know. Engagement. Teachers look for multiple ways to motivate students, letting students make choices and giving them assignments that feel relevant to their lives. That goes back to some of that culturally sustaining pedagogy. If I am in an area that has a lot of farmers and a lot of farmland, I'm thinking about where I grew up, like that is what I'm going to add into my word problems. That is the sort of, classroom engagement I'm going to bring in, while also letting students bring in, the other pieces of their life. I may not use that if I'm, like when I was teaching in New York City, talking about baling hay is not going to be being able to be connected to those students in the same way it was in rural Wisconsin. So it's about looking at what do students know, what do they connect with, and that giving of choice. We all like choices. We all like to feel in control. Now, here's the piece about UDL that I like to share. UDL is the pie in the sky what we are shooting for. And I think we can UDL most lessons for most students. But I also want to give us permission, because some educators I've worked with have felt really discouraged about, I don't know how to UDL this lesson for this student. And I want to give us permission to say we UDL as much as we can, and then if we need to accommodate and modify on top of that, that's okay. So what are accommodations versus modifications? So accommodations, supports given to help the student meet the whole class objective, and that whole class objective is tied to a state standard. It's a change of environment, curriculum format, or resource that allow for students to gain access to the content or complete an assignment. And when I say change of environment, I don't mean a segregated setting. I mean giving all students, again, going back to UDL, and ideally we give this to all students, but let's say we have a student who needs to walk around, to have some of that movement. If we have a student who needs to sit on the floor and do their work, if we need to cover up our lights because the fluorescent lighting is just not going to work, that's the sort of environmental change I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a segregated space. And importantly, and this is really important given your location, I'm assuming most folks are from North Carolina here, given the, and I think there's a few folks actually from South Carolina as well, I saw some names, that because modifications and accommodation, not accommodation, but modifications may take you off a diploma track. So accommodations do not adjust what is being taught. Examples are use of a word processor, extended time, use of a scribe. Whereas modifications, which again, can be done in general education. Sometimes I hear, oh no, we can't do that in general education. No, we certainly can. Is changing the work objective in part or all of the curriculum. And again, that is then tied to that state standard. Should still allow for as much access to the general education curriculum as possible. So here's an example. The whole class objective is that students will write a 3-page essay explaining at least 3 figures from the Revolutionary War and their significance. And this is directly tied to standards in English and history. I didn't just make this up. A student-specific objective may be, using their assistive technology, students will create a PowerPoint on one important figure from the Revolutionary War, given at least 4 relevant facts as to their significance. Do you see how we're still accessing much of the same curriculum, but not necessarily in the same way that is the whole class objective? It's a slightly toned down amount, but we're still getting a significant piece of the general education curriculum. And about you, I don't know if I could share a key person from the Revolutionary War. Take a second to take a drink, and then we'll move on to it's okay to move on. So I remember Dr. Beth Ferry drawing this on a whiteboard when I was doing my master's program. So if we pretend kindergarten is at the bottom and 12th grade is at the end, for all students, as we are in kindergarten, we're doing a lot of teaching, and I call them basic skills. I need to change that language, but we're all learning our numbers. We're all learning how to count. We're all learning how to use the bathroom. We're all learning how to raise our hand. That is things every student is learning. And we're going to do significantly less modifying and accommodating of that work. But what we expect as we move through to 12th grade, we're going to be doing much less teaching of basic or foundational skills and much more accommodating or modifying the gen ed curriculum. That's if it's needed. By the time we get to 12th grade, do we see it's sort of shifted to we're not teaching those skills, we're modifying and accommodating and then embedding those skills as needed. So when is it okay to move on? I asked myself these questions. Is this a skill needed to progress through the gen ed curriculum and it cannot be accommodated? And so the answer to that question is no, actually I can't, it's not a skill that's needed for the gen ed curriculum, or it is, but I can accommodate it. So no, we're good with that one. Is it a skill that's needed in real life? The answer is no. Then guess what? We can move on. It's okay to move on. We teach it with fidelity. We do our interventions. We try, we move on. I think back to my counting backwards. We could have spent all 12 years trying to teach her how to count backwards, or we could move on and guess what? Did high school math, algebra, geometry, calc, etc. Now you'll see some things on my screen. On the far my left, you'll see coins. This is a goal I see in IEPs all the time. No coins. You went to, Starbucks. What do you use to pay with? You use your phone, you use your watch, you use your card. And by the time our students are leave school, especially our younger ones, no one's going to be using coins. No one really uses coins now. I'm not saying if it's part of a general education standard, as it is in most states between K and third grade, second, third grade, to teach money, that we don't teach it. We absolutely teach it when it's through the Gen Ed curriculum, but it's not a skill that is so vastly important. It needs to be A, an IEP goal, and B, we have to make sure students have mastered. Middle, you'll see somebody stocking shelves. There is only one group of students we expect to be job ready day one leaving high school, and that is disabled students. Whereas the rest of us, I remember my first job outside of babysitting was working at Jimmy John's. I didn't know how many tomatoes went on. I didn't know how to cut the bread. Guess what? I got on the job training. So this fallacy that students need to leave with the exact skills that they need to get a job is simply not true. And the irony is the skills that we teach in these job, voc prep programs are not skills that are actually conducive to work in the 21st century. The last one is time. I get a lot of gift from this from my friends, but you'll look at, if any of you work in a high school or know high schoolers, one of my favorite things is to ask them is what time is it, with an analog clock on the wall. And guess what everyone does? They pull out their phone, they put up their Apple Watch, they look at the time. Again, I'm not saying to not teach time when it is a standard, but what we're going to do is move on from it, make sure we have digital, the ability to read digital time, and we move on. Again, not a skill that is needed to progress through the Gen Ed curriculum and not a real life skill. I've told you a lot of skills not to do. Let's talk about some 21st century life skills. Using assistive technology, typing, scheduling, time management, Google or Outlook calendar, advocating for yourself, and critical thinking. The best part about these is that these are all things that can be taught through the general education curriculum in the general education setting. I also want to move us from this idea of skill building, individual skill building, like we put little bricks in our students' head, to strategy building. Now, 2-3 decades ago, we would assume that students are going to leave school with all the possible skills they could have. What we know now is that with the advent of technology, students are increasing their skills. They have access to more information than ever. Meaning that my goal is not to have students have a full set of skills, but to have a set of strategies to find out what they don't know in a situation that they're not comfortable in. Meaning, I don't care if I can't sit here and pretend that I'm going to teach a student every single skill they're going to need for the rest of their life. What I can teach them is how to use their phone or the internet to figure it out. And that is the critical thinking, reasoning skills that is needed to not only progress through the Gen Ed curriculum, but is then more applicable for job readiness, living independently, going on to inclusive higher education, etc. Add the piece that the research says IEP goals, including functional skills and related services, can be met in general education classrooms, meaning all of those wonderful 21st century life skills we were talking about can be done in general education classrooms. So where do we start with this? Where do I start this? I know I spit a lot at you, but where do I start when I'm planning a lesson? I look at the standard first. And you'd be surprised how many folks haven't really taken a look at their standards. So I would encourage you, actually, I do work in North Carolina, so I have those available. we look at what does the standard say, because the standards actually give quite a bit of allowance for how students show what they know and what they're asking for. So we look at what is the true objective of the lesson. What am I really asking students to do? I rephrase that as what do I actually want my students to learn? What is that piece, if I had to distill it down to I want my students to learn X, Y, and Z? And how are my students going to demonstrate this standard? And in that, I'm looking, does the standard indicate how it has to be demonstrated? And if it does not indicate how it has to be demonstrated, then I have all of this leeway to think about how my student can best show it. And that's where I get into my no double dipping, and not just because of COVID, but because for many students, particularly those with complex needs or those where I'm purposely trying to practice 21st century life skills, this double dipping, looking at two skills at once, is not conducive to really students showing what they know. So if my standard does not say how they have to demonstrate it, I'm going to give leeway to demonstrating it exactly the best in the way that meets that child's needs. So if I have a student who, like many of our students with trisomy 21, may have fine motor difficulty, I'm not going to have them physically handwrite. How can I alter that so that they can use their strengths? Because if the standard doesn't say I have to do it, then I can do that without modifying. Now, even if the standard does say students have to demonstrate in a very specific manner, and I realize that is going to be a barrier, that's where a modification would come in to say, I'm going to modify the standard so that the student can access it. But you would be surprised how few standards actually are that specific. And my email will be up at the end if you have more questions about that. So that's what I do for all my students. And I'm now thinking about my particular focus students who may need some modifications or accommodations. Think about the first question I ask myself are, what are their strengths? What do I know they're good at? What do I know they like doing? What pieces of this is going to be a breeze? And how can I start with that? How can I embed that so that it's not just something that is hard after hard after hard? We want to embed those strengths. And so our students feel successful. All students want to feel successful. I think about what are my potential areas of challenge? Where do I envision this is going to be tricky because they are still developing a skill? And where are pieces that I know because of disability, like Down syndrome, trisomy 21 with global hypotonia, where are those barriers going to come up? Are our hands going to get really, really tired because the standard says I have to handwrite? And I know with global low muscle tone, that's going to be a challenge. And I ask myself, where can I remove this barrier? What barriers can I remove? Can I remove the handwriting? For other students, can I remove the verbalization? What can I remove the timing element? And what accommodations might this student need? Do all of that before I jump to modifications, which is changing the standard. And for many of our students with Down syndrome, we're doing a combination of those two, of accommodating and modifying. You want to keep asking yourself, where can I embed these 21st century practical life skills? If you have talked with me, as some of you have, though I hate the term life skills because it gives a very segregated intonation. What I'm talking about is the life skills that we're learning through the Gen Ed curriculum, which are actually the life skills students need. IEP goals, perhaps some of my favorite things, they need to be transferable across content and embed those 21st century life skills. So here's an example of one. Using a calculator and a checklist, students will solve 3 out of 4 two-step algebraic problems. In that, we're using a calculator. We're following independently a checklist. And I put a little asterisk next to independently because I want to take a moment to talk about this notion of working myself out of a job that I often hear special education teachers say, or fading back support. And this idea of fading back support is actually rooted in ableism. First, we would never ask somebody with glasses of, oh, when are you going to work hard enough to not need those glasses? We never ask a diabetic, when are you going to work hard enough that you're not going to need your insulin pump? These accommodations and modifications and supports are things that our students should get for the rest of their lives, and they will. these aren't special needs. There's nothing special about giving access. It's simply what is the student going to need, and that's what we give them. Our goal isn't to make them fully independent, because guess what? None of us are fully independent. Not one of us on this call, not one of us listening to this later recorded lives our lives fully independently. But for those of us who are either non-disabled or non-disabled passing, we don't get scrutinized for the support that we need, but disabled folks do. So I want to, break some of that. Our goal isn't fully independent, because nobody is fully independent. But a checklist is one of my favorite things to embed, especially third grade, fourth grade, and on. Sequencing and critical thinking skills. Again, this goal that I shared using a calculator and checklist is transferable across all units, so that it is something that can be done throughout the entire year. Let's move on to a ELA type 1. Using a word processor, assistive technology, in this case I specified Grammarly, in the checklist, student will create 2 relevant paragraphs to a teacher selected topic in 3 out of 4 opportunities. In this, we're using typing, assistive technology, critical thinking skills, and it's a goal that can be done in many subjects. We can do this in ELA, English Language Arts. We can do this in social studies. We can do this in science. All it has to be is with those supports and a teacher selected topic, which 9 times out of 10 in school, the teacher is selecting the topic. You have to create a paragraph. And I use the word create when I'm doing writing with this type of writing goal, because very few folks can write anymore. Going back to real 21st century life skills. Usually if I'm doing this in person, I'll look around and say, does anybody actually have a pencil with them? And the answer is no. Many of us use, although I truthfully am a fan of handwriting still myself, but we'll use assistive technology. And if that is what gives us access, if that is what removes that barrier, then we need to move on. I'm not saying not to teach students to write. I am saying if writing is the barrier, if the true objective of my lesson is to get that idea out, as it is in this goal, then I don't really care if they're physically handwriting, because again, it is a bar that is higher than for our non-disabled students. Okay, I just threw a lot at you. I'm going to open it up now for questions, and I'm going to put up my email. It's at the very bottom. Thank you all so much for coming. I actually got 6 minutes under my record speed for this presentation. And I'm going to open it up for questions now. And I'm going to stop sharing. And then I can, if folks need my email still, let me know. Sean, did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Okay,
thank
great.
you.
And I'm fine if folks either want to unmute or put it in the chat for questions.
Yes, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or raise your hand and we can call on you.
I'm glad it's been helpful, Meg.
Hey, Sarah. It's Christy.
Hey, Christy.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for joining.
Good. I have a question about high school, going into high school. I know you've helped me with Avery before.
Yeah.
But I guess the main thing going into high school, when they come back and tell you, South Carolina diploma and stuff like that. And as far as needing algebra and biology, and her not showing any interest in it and frustrated, and then them coming back and saying, but is she going to really need this? So why are we not doing something where she would be more interested in and not feeling frustrated? Do you know where I'm going with this kind of a little bit?
Yeah, no, I do. I will say my first answer is I also wasn't interested in algebra or biology, quite frankly. And we do a disservice to disabled students by pretending that they get to, pick and choose. And what we're robbing them of is an opportunity to have to progress and do things that quite frankly, we don't want to do. I'm sure all of us have things in our jobs that we don't want to do. So that is a real skill right there of just like, I quite frankly don't want to do this, but I have to. The second piece is what we're learning through that curriculum. That is going to probably be challenging, frustrating, what have you. The support that gives for any student, but Avery's development is of paramount importance, because the thinking, that strategy, that skill building that we're going to get through something like algebra, through something like biology, is something that we cannot emulate anywhere else. So it's yes, I agree. Like, do many of us remember anything from high school biology? Like, no, I don't. But maybe that's just me. I was just a bad student. But what it does give, what she is going to gain, is all of those critical thinking skills, the opportunity to practice doing something that's quite frankly not fun. But it's about the brain development and the skills that are gained through that curriculum versus like me necessarily caring if she gets every standard. And she's going to have a lot of time, and she's going to have a lot of time to be able to pick what they want to do. And we're robbing a student of a really important skill, because guess what then she's going to learn is, if I don't like something, if I don't show interest in something, then I don't have to do it. And what's going to happen then when she is, applying for college and she has to take a course she doesn't want to do, or she gets a job and she has to do something she doesn't want to do. So that would be what I would go, as well as the development for her and the skills through that curriculum. That's where I would start. And you know how to get a hold of me if you need anything. Hey, Elima Sanchez, another familiar face. I see your hands up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so I do have a question. Actually, I have two questions, but first and foremost, what I guess would be the strongest response to, we're going to ask for our one-to-one to be included in our IAP meeting, because they spend the most time with our daughter. And we've been rejected before, stating that, there's not enough resources for somebody to lead the class while the one-to-one is there, plus the teacher. So what would be your response to that, if any, so that we have a kind of a ground to go on?
Yeah, great question. I would start with making sure that the request is in writing. And then, can you just mute yourself, Ellie? I hear myself back when I get distracted. So I would start with that. I would start with that, that she or he are a vital member of the team, and that, if needed, we can always go outside of, school hours. But my parental right is to fully participate and have access to all of the information and relevant decision making, and we can't do that without this team member. There's also some guidance. I can't remember if it's state level or from the Department of Ed that helps clarify that. But that is something that I can send as well. But I would say we put it in writing, and we stress that this is my, that we tie it back to our parental rights of involvement, because it's not, I can't participate if I don't have all the same information. I don't have all the same information if a vital team member is not there. And so we requested enough ahead of time so that they can get coverage. And that our expectation is that we get coverage, and if they're not there, then we will, rise it through the levels up to and including, the state complaint if needed. Did that answer your question?
Yes, that answers the first question. And second, and this is more for everyone else here, is just because we have had pushback on a communication journal. My daughter is not verbal enough to tell me what goes on in her day-to-day activities at school. I've asked for a communication journal. It started at the beginning of the year, and then administration decided it was too daunting for the teachers to write a little blip about Aurora's day, and they cut that out. And obviously we're going to go forward and ask for it again. I just want to know, for everybody's sake, you know, if we ask for a communication journal, what is the answer to administration saying, well, that's just too much of a task for administration or for the teachers?
So our response is, you know, again, it is my, you know, right under IDA for parental participation, and I cannot do that if I don't have access. And if it's a staffing issue, would sound like, you know, administration on your end, you need to do your due diligence to ensure that there is coverage, that there is proper staffing. I would say, you know, we're certainly willing to talk about what that communication log will look like, if it's paper, if it's digital, but that it is something that, you know, we are expecting, and that in order to provide FAPE so we can carry through at home, we can talk, we have, you know, dignity of communication, that is done. So that's where I would start. And if it's something that is not done, you know, we, you know, move it up the chain at the county level, or district level, and then we progress it through, and add the journal as an aid and support foundation. Yep. So under the piece we needed written in, much like with the asking for the one-on-one to be in our meetings, in our IEP meetings, I'm gonna make sure that's in the IEP, that we specify how often daily communication log is sent back and forth. That way, we can say, you know, you're not following the IEP if it is not followed. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, and I thought of one more while you were speaking, and I
Yeah,
apologize. But coming back to, you mentioned it earlier about them setting some kind of milestone. And again, this is more for other parents because I've been there, done that. But they set a milestone that my daughter had to be able to recite her ABCs before she could have gen ed time. How do you approach that, and what is the answer to that? That you know, she doesn't need to be able to recite her ABCs just to have gen ed time.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, first, does every other student have to recite their ABCs? And then I would look at, okay, I would then say, you know, well, Oberti actually says this, or can you show me in state, district, federal policy where it says that is A, allowed, and B, best practice. So again, we push using the Oberti precedent that, nope, we don't have to earn our way in. And then if they push back and say, well, we're allowed to, we can, okay, show it to me in writing. I guarantee you it doesn't exist. So that, yes, that's something super, super common I hear all the time. And then if they do not sway, we follow up in writing. So please put into writing for me what my student needs to demonstrate or show before you will consider general education placement. That way you have it in writing, and that way you can move on through your due process rights. I got a question privately, so I won't say your name, but it says, my daughter is repeating kindergarten in the EC classroom, and they have been taking her throughout the day to gen ed classes. My question is, should I push for gen ed instead? You know, I will say this, it's very easy for me to say you should do X, Y, and Z, as I'm, you know, here in my apartment in Syracuse. But I will say this, without knowing any like other, you know, factors, yes, I think the best place for all students is general education. We start this kind of slippery slope. 0.002% of students who are ever in a segregated setting ever get out. So I also want you to keep that in mind as you're going through placement discussions, that this kind of promise of, oh, we'll push them in as they're ready, doesn't actually happen. The numbers don't show it. They simply don't. And for those of you, you know, for those of you in South Carolina, I know, you know, your district doesn't say. I know in North Carolina, there's no county that does that. That students are moving to less restrictive environments. So yes, I would push for gen ed. I would push for it early, and then I would, you know, stay strong. It is not impossible, you know, if you have a student who's been a segregated placement to 6th grade to then get to full inclusion, we can certainly do that. But it is significantly easier to do. And when I say easier, I mean getting it done in the IEP realm when we do it early. It also sets the standard that this is where we expect our student and that our student knows this is where I'm going to be. It's confusing going back and forth. So yeah, I would certainly push early on. And I say this, we can have EC support, but my student's home base, my student is a member of that general education classroom. They're on the list. They are there, 98% of the day, and you can bring those EC supports in. But no, the student is a full member of that general education classroom. Because I also want us to conceptualize and think about, what does that mean when I have a student as their home base over there and the trailers in the back? What does that mean? Who is a second-class citizen and who is viewed as human? I would argue a lot what we do in segregated spaces is we're working on fixing the student, dehumanizing them. So that is my long roundabout way of saying, yes, I would advocate that she is fully in gen ed with EC supports pushed in. And I'm happy to talk, privately on more specifics, but I would say, yes, I would push for that, and I would push for that again. Her home base is gen ed. Our home base is always gen ed. Brian, I see your hand is up. You want to unmute now?
Hi, it's actually Kelly and Brian.
Oh, Kelly, sorry.
That's okay. It's Kelly and Brian, so it's both of us. We are wondering, as our son is 9, so he's going into 3rd grade, and he was removed last year from the particular program in our counties between the academic support program and the standard
SDA.
the standard development program or something. I don't know. One is where he would go, the IAS is where he would go through school, I guess regularly, I don't know the right term. And he would take, his EOGs, get a diploma. So he was removed from that last year. And now he's in that standard course where he would basically get a certificate of achievement at the end of high school. And he does have gen ed time. And he has a lot of time in EC, but our question is, we know that he's very with it. He's very smart. And I know that he could do better. So how do we get him back in we let them railroad us last year. It was very emotional, and they took over, and we had to move schools, the whole thing. And so we were very happy with moving schools, but we were not happy with the program switch. So now we don't know how to get him.
When you say you're not happy with the program switch, I guess, let me say this. I don't believe in any sort of programming. There's no box programming. I don't care. You have your special unicorn program that you think is the best. I don't want to hear, I say this to teams all the time. Some of you have heard me say it to teams. I don't really care what programs you have. I care about what supports the student needs. But are you concerned, when you say you're concerned, that you're not happy with, is it the diploma piece, or is it the
Inclusion part?
Or is it the inclusion part? Or is it both?
It's both. It was the inclusion part, and the fact that I feel like, I do think that he is making progress, but I think that they took away a lot of potential progress from him by putting him in that box with only a couple of kids, disabled kids in his class. And so I just feel like they took it away from him to where he could be doing more.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is that I'm not saying that students don't make progress in these segregated settings. I'm saying students don't make as much progress as they could. So yes, I think there's certainly, you can definitely get him back in. I think it's going to take, really pushing. And if you're happy with the school he's at, in terms of, it sounds like that, perhaps the old school wasn't working.
No,
for
it was
a variety of reasons. I would, might frame it as, we're happy to keep getting this support at this school, but it needs to be pushed in, because here's what the law says. It says, it needs to be pushed in. I don't care, if this is your teacher who does it, then we need to figure out staffing. I don't really care. about what, what your specific program is. But I think what may be the best is if we, if you shoot me an email and we talk offline.
Okay.
Some more specifics. That way we can really get into the nitty gritty of what their argument is and then how you refute it. If that's all right.
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
So I'm gonna scroll up. Answer that. So I have a question that says, we're in the self-contained classroom. The gap is getting bigger, as you stated. Any suggestions to ramp up the extended core curriculum for her to get more and be challenged? I would say the first thing I would do is getting out of that setting. Just simply by being in general education, you're going to have more access to pieces. I also, what I do when I work with students and work with teachers whose students are on extended content standards but are in general education, is I actually go side by side and I look at what is the general education standard and what is the core content standard. And then I look at what is my student going to do. So I do 3 columns: standard, extended content standard, what my student is going to be doing. And if you're interested in that, I have that made for 3rd grade. And now, of course, the last column is more child specific. But I would go back again, looking at the standards next to one another. But pushing to be in general ed would be I think the biggest piece. I know schools and districts cannot legally use lack of funding, staffing center to justify a separation. But what do we do when we have job openings and no one applies? How do we provide the best practices when it's not a matter of willingness to hire staff but genuinely cannot get people? Yeah, must be in education. I would say definitely reach out. Something that's underutilized by a lot of schools is reaching out to schools of education at the universities around you. If you haven't sent out postings looking there, I've worked with a school district to create like a pathway from their student teaching into employment. And that is a way in one district I worked in to help with that. And then we want to look at creativity around staffing and funding. And so I would move my staff. I had a very similar conversation earlier today. I want to use my most trained staff for students who need the most support. So I'm going to be moving folks around. And so what I've done with other districts who are facing 20% job openings, and I still want to include students with complex needs, is looking at where we have staff and where we can move staff. And that may also mean looking at how we do support differently. So if you're a school district that is facing big staff openings, as I'm sure many are, and are interested in that, I'm happy to sit down with you and show you, some ways we can, when we have those job openings that we cannot, get applicants for. And I would say for parents on the call to also be understanding of, we have massive job openings across the country, and it is often not an unwillingness to do, but right now we're facing a opening and no one applies. So let's look at how we can be creative with the staff we have. Let's look at how we can create partnerships with universities. Let's look at how we can help move paraprofessionals into teaching roles through different certifications and how district can support that. And again, these are all things I've done with other districts, and I'm happy to talk with you about them. And since we need to change these certification laws, yeah, I agree. I would go as far as to say is we need to completely rethink IDEA. Okay, next question. When parents are facing pre-K testing, how do we go about the requirements, as no IEP has been determined as of yet, but parents want a gen ed placement? So I would back up and say that we're not supposed to use things like testing for placement. This is just the testing that is done, the triennial testing is just help us determine the needs, what services in terms of like speech, PT, OT, and then does the student qualify? If you're somebody who has a student who is not yet in school and they're doing testing, my biggest piece of advice is to say no to IQ or cognitive testing. Because while that is not supposed to be used for placement, it often is. And yes, for your thinking, yes, I know you may need it later for adult services. You can always do it later. But what I've seen is IQ tests done in pre-K being used for high school to say why a student needs to be segregated. And remember, no testing can be done without your written consent. So you say no, we don't get consent.
Hey, Sarah Jo, it's Ellie, and I asked that question.
Yeah.
Just real quick, because again, we were in a different state at the time, Oklahoma. They required cognitive, but then also life skill testing. And when they found out that she was not potty trained, they said that she could not qualify for her pre-K program. Again, this is before I knew my rights, but it was solely based on the potty training. And I bet a lot of us parents here are struggling with the same, even at a second, third grade, fourth grade level. So what do you say to that when that's part of your quote unquote testing?
That I mean, I would say the biggest thing we would want to do before we even get to that is saying no to a significant amount of testing. I think skills-based inventories, good. And then, speech, PTOT, put that aside, talking about purely academic and cognitive functioning. They're not going to tell us anything, is what that comes down to. Life skill tests, IQ tests, cognitive tests are not going to tell us anything that is going to be useful in terms of our teaching and curriculum development. So our best thing is a proactive strategy of simply not allowing that. If you have allowed that, I then would say, again, that question of show me where in the state federal regs says that a student who is not potty trained cannot access this. I would also say we got some really good guidance in terms of how ADA and 504 also apply to students who qualify for IEPs. So is it a discriminatory practice on its face? If we had a student who, just for, maybe was in a wheelchair, didn't qualify for special educational services, could keep up with gen ed curriculum without any supports, but simply needed, help with nursing services. They may qualify under, they certainly qualify under some of these other anti-discrimination laws, which is what ADA is versus a funding law, which is what IDEA is. So we would also want to look at some of that, but always going back to show it to me in writing. Show it to me in writing, and show it to me in writing that the para can't do that. Show it to me in writing, and if it's not a district, federal or state policy, quite frankly, even if it is a district or state policy and it goes against IDEA, then we need to be doing it. So always asking for it in writing. And testing, again, I don't ever recommend getting an IQ test, getting any sort of cognitive testing. Okay, and ask the gen ed classes using OG, I'm assuming, or in Gillingham, and the special ed teachers using Linda Mood Bell during resource time. The teacher says she needs 45 minutes to work on it daily. Thoughts? Well, I think I would ask a few questions. Does the school have like intervention time, what I need time? And if so, then I would just do the Linda Mood Bell during that time. If we see that we need this and we agree, yeah, you need this, we can also use the extended school year statute to extend our students' school day. To say, that's fine, you can do that, but you can do that after school because we're not going to remove from the general education time. But Anne, I would say shoot me an email and let's talk more specifics because if the general education class is using OG, and I'm guessing because OG is an intervention, I'm guessing they're using some curriculum that's OG based. And if this, I'm curious if the special education teacher is actually Linda Mood Bell certified or if she's just using it. But yeah, a lot of these interventions will typically say you need X amount of time to do them with fidelity. I wouldn't be I may not necessarily be opposed to 45 minutes if it was done during a time where no new instruction was happening. Because again, being included doesn't mean we're not going to give students what they need, but I think there are ways to do it without segregating our our students. I know there are ways to do it without segregating our students. So send me an email and let's talk more specifics. Also, if you're really getting OG and Linda Mood Bell, at a point it's like how much we're not going to be making any more progress the more we throw on. I say specially designed instruction is like a vitamin. There's a sweet spot of it. Too little doesn't help us. Too much will actually hurt us. So let's talk more specifics. And that's really the hardest part about inclusion is I wish I could just give you a formula, but it just depends on what the student needs. We have 19 folks here, probably all 19 students need different things. All of them can be included, but just need different supports. Any other questions? Yeah, Ms. Sanchez, go ahead.
Okay, one, I promise I'll try to keep this to my last one. But so for those of us who are in the kind of advocating realm where we really want to help other parents and teach other parents, and we're part of these groups on Facebook and et cetera, the biggest thing I see is that parents really believe that the schools are going to do what's in the best interest of their child, and they tend to just go along with whatever is recommended for their child. I guess my question is, what are the accessible resources, the quick links, if you will? Is that something you can share that's like quick links to these are your rights, and this is how you go about getting into your very first IEP meeting so that your child does not miss out on the education they should be getting?
Yeah, I'll start with, as hard as it is, and I say as hard as it is because it's certainly hard for me to do sometimes, is I start with going at the assumption that nobody gets into education to hurt students. And while I may fundamentally disagree with folks, and to my core fundamentally disagree, I always remind myself that that's people get into education, they do what they think is best. Now that doesn't mean that that's actually happening or that they're working in best practice, but I always start there. And I would say there's a lot of really great accessible things. Understood has some easy things. I can send out in my follow-up, I can send out some of those, like what we call like plain language resources. But I also think for parents on the call, one of the most pivotal things I hear, anecdotally, and also what I'll tell you the research says is parent to parent, like knowing that this is possible, sharing those stories is one of the, the best ways to get that information out there. Because you're right. We know that so many folks just go along with what the school says, because the assumption is that schools, have the most up-to-date information, but we know that that's not the case in this realm. And quite frankly, a lot of realms, this realm specifically, folks are working with outdated, antiquated information that is done, although maybe with the best of intentions, in ways that really hone back to institutionalization. It was born right out of institutionalization and dehumanizing of disabled folks. So first, start with the premise that our educators get into it for the right reasons. Parent-to-parent networking and support is so important. And I will send out I don't want to say easy to read, but like the not a super overwhelming stuff to start with in terms of what are your parental rights, what is placement, what is inclusion, those types of things. Because no one, is necessarily going out and shouting this from the rooftop, although some of us are.
Yeah, and for my husband's here with me, and for his peace of mind, he really wants kind of highlighted, like, when is it okay to say no? When is it okay to reject that? And I honestly, I go with it's always to say no, okay to say no. But again, how do you tactfully approach that when you're disagreeing?
Yeah. And I think, I would start with, it's okay to say no, because we know that school placement determines the quality of life. We're not just in this because it's a feel good, like I want kids included. I want kids included because I know that it's what leads to them having the most opportunities for their life. So I think it's always okay to say no. It's always okay to say, you know what, I'm going to stop this meeting right now. Although as some of us on the call know, that doesn't always happen. But say, I need to stop this meeting, or we need to reconvene this meeting. We need to come back to this because we're not in agreement. I'm not in agreement. You know, I think it is always okay to say no. If you have that feeling that it's not okay, or it's not aligning with what we know is best practice, we say no, we regroup, and we come back. And an IEP is a fluid document. You can end a meeting with one thing and call an IEP meeting the next day. You can call an IEP meeting every single day if you want, and we have to have one. So it's always okay to say no. I think where the strategy comes in and some of the nuances of like advocacy and negotiation are really dependent on, you know, is this your first go around with the school? Are you in a position to, you know, able to hire a lawyer? In terms of if you were to go to due process, are you, you know, can we live with 15 minutes here? I would say there are huge lines in the sand for me, that, you know, the feds use 80% or more of the day in gen ed. So that's what I use, although I truthfully like that closer to 90, 95. Accessing gen ed curriculum, whether it's modified or not. You know, those are the big lines in the sand for me. So I think what I would say, you with your spouse, or your partner, your co-parent, whoever, with a friend, you know, looking at what are my lines in the sand. And I think for me, placement is one of those lines in the sand. And then that's where, you know, we can, you know, talk, you know, both you, Ms. Sanchez, and other folks about like, hey, what is the best, you know, strategy here? Sometimes going in, and you know, meeting with the special educator, the EC director is the way to go. Sometimes we just want to, we need to, you know, that's not going to help us. So if you have questions about like the best way to advocate, or, you know, some different insight on that, I'm happy to chat as well.
And yeah, because my most recent circumstance was them, you know, they attempted to forego the meeting without parents present. And there were some questions in my Down syndrome group on Facebook about how do you approach that, because other parents apparently have also succumbed to the same thing and were subjected to. They continued the meeting without parental permission, and I know there has to be a statute or a law somewhere that says that is not okay.
Yeah, so IDAC's parents have the right to participate. And if you're not there, you can't participate. Now that does also give, which is why, like, if any of you follow me on social media, you know, I'm fairly vocal about like, I don't think I'm not a scholar that's going to say like IDA is this magical thing. I quite frankly think we need to like completely redo IDEA. It needs to look completely different, because it also gives the allowance of if you make X amount of good faith attempts. I've always heard 3 good faith attempts, then you're okay to move on. But that's where, you know, following up with, hey, we left the meeting today, it continued without us, we requested this, following it up in writing so that that's documented, and then moving that up the chain, and then immediately calling for another IEP meeting. Because while they did continue, like it can, one thing be written one day and one thing be written the next. And and keep coming back to, if they said, well, this was decided the last meeting, well, without ourselves, the parents, who, you know, per IDA, we have the right to parental participation. But unfortunately, it does happen. And that's where, you know, then we may consider filing a state complaint. We may, you know, go through, you know, due process. We may, you know, send a letter to the superintendent. It just, some of that then becomes advocacy strategy.
Thank you for answering that, and I appreciate it. I know I'm not trying to make it about our case specifically, but I get a lot of pushback, even just in my Facebook groups about, well, no, our school told us X, Y, and Z. And so it's hard to, once a school tells you something, they think that as like fact, and it's hard to reach them and tell them, no, these are still your rights.
Yes. And I think, you know, again, while all of best intention, schools often don't really know what IDEA says. Teachers don't know what IDEA says. And that comes back to a problem of how we're educating pre-service teachers. who then become administrators. It's how, folks who are getting these advanced degrees who don't actually have any conceptualization of what IDEA says. And I recognize not everyone has taken courses like myself at a top-notch law school. Through my PhD, I got to take, classes at Syracuse University's College of Law under Arlene Cantor. Like, not many people have gone to do that, I recognize. And it doesn't negate their responsibility to know. So, saying, okay, show it to me, show it to me. Where does it say that in writing is one of would be my go-to, first go-to round of show me in writing where it says this in your policies or the state policies or the federal policies. And if you can't, then it's simply not true. As we know in special education, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Any other questions I can help answer? I know I threw a lot. I hope this was helpful to everyone. But I will be sending, I know NCDSA will send out, I have my list, my slides, some info for parents, and they'll have my contact information as well.
So I want to just piggyback on a couple things that you said, Sarah Jo, because I am the advocacy director as well. And I love how you keep saying, get it in writing. And I like to stress to parents that we don't do it that way is not a policy. Just like we don't have the money, that's not within the law. And then I know a lot of us go into the public education thinking that the educators have our child's best interest. And I agree with that, except unless they have a lived experience, they do not know what we are going through or what we are even talking about. Because like you said, most of our educators have not had special education background, but that only brings it to a certain point.
Well, and I say this, the decisions that we make around the IEP table may affect you educators for a year, but it affects this child for the rest of their life. And by that extension, it affects their family for the rest of their life. So, I like to, try to humanize that of like, this isn't just like a willy-nilly decision. Like, unless you live it, you see the longevity of it, the importance of that.
And that's what a lot of people don't know, like the second part of the purpose of IDEA. It's to prepare our students for post-secondary education or further education, employment, and independent living. And I loved how you talked about teaching strategy instead of exact concepts, because that is going, the critical thinking skills, regardless of your child's ability, they can think through things, is going to help them in their further life post high school, which is what IDEA is supposed to prepare them for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
and yes, I love that Meg put in there in the chat. For us, this is a marathon and they're looking at it as a sprint. Absolutely. Again, your first grade teacher, your kindergarten teacher is not going to be there when they graduate high school and say, okay, which college are you going to pick? With post-secondary, what's next? They're not. I love that idea.
Well, if there are no more questions, I know Ellie still has her hand up. I don't know if it's still up. But if we don't have any more questions, I want to thank Sara Jo so much for donating your time and your expertise to be here with us tonight, and to spend this much time with us and to share this much information with us. We are very grateful for that. I'd like to remind the few people that are on here that we have the virtual speaker series is going to go through March. Some of the other sessions, the next one in August is future planning. Then we have ditching the diapers. There are a few others that are confirmed but aren't publicized yet because we have some gaps in the schedule. So again, Sara Jo, thank you very much for tonight. Everyone for participating that's still on, thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us and having your faith in the greater Down syndrome community in North Carolina.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are quite welcome.